What happens when the person who always pulls away suddenly realizes you stopped chasing? Often people assume that if an avoidant partner goes silent and you go silent too, the relationship simply fades away. They imagine both people quietly moving on. The door is shut, the chapter is done, and both people simply move on. But that's rarely what actually happens. When two people enter mutual no contact, especially when one of them has avoidant attachment, the dynamic doesn't end, it transforms. What actually begins is a psychological process that unfolds quietly in both minds. Underneath the silence, both minds begin processing the absence in very different ways. The nervous system that once reacted to pressure now reacts to distance. Memory starts shifting. Curiosity appears where certainty used to exist. And the longer that silence lasts, the more revealing the process becomes. Because when you finally stop reaching out to someone who expected you to keep trying, you remove the emotional pattern they had quietly learned to rely on. And that changes everything. First, the pressure disappears for the avoidant. When someone with avoidant attachment pulls away, it's usually because emotional closeness begins to feel overwhelming. Intimacy activates their nervous system in a way that feels like pressure rather than comfort. So when the other person keeps reaching out, asking questions, trying to fix things, or demanding clarity, it actually intensifies the avoidance instinct to withdraw further. But when both people go no contact, something surprising happens. The emotional pressure drops. There are no texts to respond to, no conversations about feelings, no expectations waiting on the other side of the phone. For an avoidant nervous system, that silence initially feels like relief. This is why in the early stage of mutual no contact, avoidants often appear completely unaffected. They might seem calm, busy, or even happier. They focus on work, hobbies, friends, or distractions. On the surface, it can look like they've moved on immediately, but that early calm doesn't tell the full psychological story. What's happening internally takes longer to surface. Then the absence becomes noticeable. Avoidant attachment doesn't eliminate emotional bonds. It simply suppresses them when closeness feels threatening. Once the relationship pressure disappears, the avoidant brain slowly begins processing the absence. And this is where something interesting happens. Without constant reminders of conflict or emotional demands, the avoidant mind often starts remembering the relationship differently. The arguments fade first. The tension fades. What remains are the neutral or positive memories. This isn't manipulation or intentional nostalgia. It's a cognitive pattern psychologists sometimes call distance-based emotional clarity. When immediate stress disappears, the brain begins reconstructing the experience from a calmer place. Many avoidants only start missing someone after space has existed long enough for their nervous system to feel safe again. And mutual no contact creates exactly that environment. But the silence also affects you. Most conversations about avoidant dynamics focus only on what the avoidant person is thinking. But the other side of the equation matters just as much. When you stop contacting someone you once cared deeply about, your mind also goes through stages. At first, there's usually restlessness, the urge to reach out, the habit of checking your phone, the mental replay of conversations and what you wish you had said differently. That stage is uncomfortable, but it's also important. Because, it's the moment where emotional energy that used to flow toward the relationship has nowhere to go. And that energy eventually begins turning inward. People start rediscovering routines they neglected. Friendships regain attention. Personal goals that were paused during the relationship start moving forward again. What began as silence slowly becomes space. And space often becomes clarity. Why avoidants often react later than expected. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidant attachment is the idea that they simply don't care. That's rarely accurate. Avoidant individuals often process emotional loss more slowly than other attachment styles. Their coping strategy is to suppress feelings while the situation feels intense. But suppression isn't the same as absence. When the emotional environment becomes calmer, which mutual no contact creates, suppressed feelings sometimes resurface. This is why months of silence can pass before an avoidant suddenly reaches out, views a story, or sends a casual message that seems unrelated to the past. From the outside, it may look random. Psychologically, it usually isn't. The delayed reaction is often the result of their nervous system finally feeling safe enough to acknowledge what was previously pushed aside. Mutual no contact changes the power dynamic. Another shift happens during prolonged silence, and it has less to do with emotion and more to do with perception. In relationships where one person constantly pursues and the other withdraws, a psychological imbalance forms. The pursuer becomes predictable, and predictability removes mystery. Avoidants, like most people, tend to become curious when patterns suddenly change. When the person who always tried to reconnect suddenly stops, it interrupts expectations. That interruption forces the avoidant mind to reevaluate the situation. Not because silence is a manipulation tactic, but because, humans naturally notice when familiar behavior disappears. The absence becomes information. But the most important shift happens inside you. The real value of mutual no contact isn't whether the avoidant returns. It's what happens to your own psychology during that time. Without constant emotional uncertainty, your mind gradually moves out of survival mode. The obsessive thinking slows down. The need for answers loses intensity. You begin asking different questions. Instead of, why won't they choose me? The question becomes, what kind of relationship actually works for me? That shift is subtle, but it's powerful. Because it moves the focus from trying to manage someone else's behavior to understanding your own emotional needs. And that's where real healing begins. Sometimes avoidants do come back. It's important to be honest about this. Mutual no contact does sometimes lead to reconnection. Once emotional pressure disappears and curiosity grows, avoidants may reach out again. But when that happens, the outcome depends on whether the underlying attachment patterns have actually changed. If both people have used the time to grow, reflect, and develop better emotional awareness, a healthier connection might be possible. If nothing has changed, the same push and pull dynamic usually returns. Psychology doesn't reward repetition. Patterns only evolve when the people inside them evolve. Silence reveals the truth of the relationship. One of the most underrated psychological benefits of no contact is that it reveals the real structure of the connection. When communication stops, only two outcomes exist. Either both people gradually move forward with their lives, or eventually, someone feels the absence enough to reconnect. Both outcomes provide clarity, and clarity is often more valuable than temporary reassurance. Understanding the deeper lesson. The real psychological lesson of mutual no contact isn't about strategy. It's about boundaries and emotional self-respect. Silence becomes powerful not because it forces someone else to react, but because it stops a cycle where one person constantly tries to earn closeness from someone who struggles to offer it. When you stop chasing, the dynamic stops running. And once the pattern pauses long enough, you can finally see it clearly. Sometimes that clarity leads to reconciliation. Other times it leads to the realization that peace feels better than uncertainty ever did. Both outcomes are forms of progress. If you enjoy exploring the deeper psychology behind human behavior, relationships, and the hidden patterns that shape how people connect, subscribe to It's All Psychological and share this video with someone who wants to understand the mind, not just react to it.